Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm a 737 pilot and a member of PMDG's tech team. So, in today's video we will discuss Tailstrikes. Fellow developer Robert Mirosevsky recently gave me some statistics from his New Sky program, and something that really caught my eye there was the amount of tailstrikes that we are seeing in flight simulation. So, in his statistics, from approximately 200 takeoffs done, there are roughly 3 tailstrikes that we see. That is the amount of 1.5% of overall flight simulator takeoffs done that do result in a tailstrike. And that is something that really caught my attention. Now, in real life, of course, tailstrikes do happen as well, and actually we can have a look at some Airbus statistics right over here. So we can see from the A320 CBTs uploaded on this channel up here, tailstrikes events continue to happen, and 29% of them do happen on takeoff, while 69% do happen on landing and 2% on touch-and-go training. Now that is real-life A320 family data that we are looking over here. Now, in Flight Simulator, things used to be exactly the other way around. Approximately 90% of tailstrikes do happen on takeoff, with only 10% happening on landing. And that is something that I do find very worth actually looking into. So, in today's video, we are going to discuss the reasons for tailstrikes, what we can do to prevent them from happening, and finally, a quick look into the 737 and a couple of the possible factors. So we do see our 737 up here, and let's have a look at this. We are at the tailplane over here, and we do have our tail skid. Now, I've covered the tail skid in a separate video already, so I can very much recommend you to have a look at that if you are interested in a further reading. But the most important thing that we can look at over here is that the tail skid is located at the approximate position where the tail of the airplane would be expected to hit the ground in case a tail strike does happen. And the tail skid is designed to prevent further damage from happening, and has a little tool for maintenance to determine how severe the tail strike was and what course of action might be possible to fix the airplane. However, with that said, let's have a look into why tail strikes even occur and what factors lead to them. So, I will go along with the Boeing flight crew training manual over here, and will give you a couple of the details that I mentioned in there. Tail strikes occur when the lower aft fuselage or tail skid as installed contacts the runway during takeoff or landing. A significant factor that appears to be common is the lack of flight crew experience in the model being flown. A tail strike can be identified by the flight crew or cabin crew. Any one of the following conditions can be an indication of a tail strike during rotation or flare: a noticeable bump or jolt, a scraping noise from the tail of the airplane, the pitch rate stopping momentarily, and if you are flying an aircraft equipped with a head-up display, especially in the 737-800 or the 737-9, the tail strike HUD warning as installed may be displayed. Note: anytime fuselage contact is suspected or confirmed, accomplish the appropriate non-normal checklist without delay. We will go into the non-normal checklists a little bit later on in this video, but let's first of all talk about the takeoff risk factors. Understanding the factors that contribute to a tail strike can reduce the possibility of a tail strike occurrence. Any one of the following takeoff risk factors may precede a tail strike. Number 1. Mistrimmed stabilizer. And this usually results from using erroneous takeoff data, for example, wrong weights or an incorrect center of gravity. Now that does directly relate to the loading information that the crew is given, and now this is a little bit more of a real-life thing than a flight simulator thing, even though in flight simulator people often forget to actually trim their aircraft. So if we do have a look over here in the cockpit, then we can see that in the PMDG 737 we just about have to enter the CG, and it gives us a resultant trim, for example in this case 6 units. But did you actually make that setting over here? The takeoff configuration warning is not going to sound if your stabilizer is trimmed anywhere within the green band, so unless your trim is actually out of the green band, the aircraft will not alert you to this happening. Do note as well that in case you're entering it manually, that you will have to make sure that you are actually entering the correct numbers. This is something that we will see in a practical example later on, but for example here we have a CG of 21%, but what if we accidentally entered 11%? then we would get a trim recommendation of 7.5 units nose up, which would be significantly higher than the actual trim required, and therefore would easily increase the rate of rotation of the nose during the takeoff, thereby making us prone to encountering a tail strike. So be very sure that you enter your center of gravity correctly. In the PMDG, if you want to cheat, you can make it easy and just click on the line select key next to the center of gravity, like this, and this is automatically going to bring up the actual CG of the airplane for you to enter. And do note, by the way, that I'm getting 19 here. I've had 21 entered previously. That was purely for demonstrational purposes of showing you how easy the entry error might be between, for example, 11 and 21%. So, the flight crew can prevent this type of error and correct the condition by challenging the reasonableness of the load sheet numbers. So comparing the load sheet numbers against past experience in the airplane can assist in approximating numbers that are reasonable. So for example, in my airline, we're usually getting CGs in the region somewhere between 15 to maybe 21, 22-ish, and the resulting trim settings, if the airplane is at a lower weight, so for example, on a flight anywhere up to 3 hours, is usually in the region of approximately 6 units nose up, while if we're flying long sectors such as to the Canaries, then it's usually in the region somewhere around 4 to 5 units nose up. Rather 5 than 4. So just be reasonable there and make sure that you actually have the correct center of gravity set and the correct amount of takeoff trim actually set as well. And do note the limitations of the takeoff configuration warning system in this point. Next up is rotation at improper speed. The situation can result in a tail strike and is usually caused by early rotation due to some unusual situation or rotation at a too low airspeed for the weight and or flap setting. Once again, that is something that we will see later on in a case study. The next important point here, trimming during rotation. Trimming the stabilizer during rotation may contribute to a tail strike. The pilot flying may easily lose the feel of the elevator while the trim is running, which may result in an excessive rotation rate. So, once again, be very sure not to trim your airplane during the rotation. So, even if you have an incorrect stabilizer trim setting, as long as it is anywhere within the takeoff band, you will have sufficient elevator authority available to rotate the airplane, and once the plane is airborne, you can then retrim your stabilizer. This leads us directly into the next problem, which is excessive rotation rate. Flight crews operating an airplane model new to them, especially when transitioning from an airplane with unpowered flight controls to one with hydraulic assistance, are most vulnerable to using excessive rotation rate. The amount of control column input required to achieve the proper rotation rate varies from one model to another. When transitioning to a new model, flight crews may not realize that it does not respond to the pitch input in exactly the same way as their previous model. Now that is something very important in flight simulation. For example, if you have flown the A310 previously, which needed a little bit more nose-up input than the 737, it might very easily happen to you that the 737's nose may just about shoot up. Finally, there is one point, that is improper use of the flight director. The flight director provides accurate pitch guidance only after the airplane is airborne. With a proper rotation rate, the airplane reaches 35 feet with the desired pitch attitude of about 15 degrees. However, an aggressive rotation into the pitch bar at takeoff is not appropriate and can cause a tail strike. So just be aware, at 64 knots during the takeoff run, your pitch bar is going to move from 10 degrees nose down to 15 degrees nose up. That is in no means any guidance for rotation. That is purely for the flight director's internal logic, and it is in no means any guidance to the pilot. There has been that recent Emirates accident, or almost accident, let's call it an incident, where they did not rotate because that bar stayed down, and they went over the runway end at, I believe, something around 240 knots without rotating. So don't use the flight director for rotation. It only becomes available once the airplane is airborne. Now, that is the most important risk factors listed by Boeing in the flight crew training manual. Now, let's quickly think about flight simulation as well and the things that we can do over here. I have recently released a video on the perfect rotation, and if you haven't seen that one yet, I would very much recommend you to check it out. Now, for the actual rotation in Flight Simulator, be aware of the following. First of all, control column movement. Take a small moment to check how far your control column in the flight deck moves when you are moving your joystick. So, when you're about to initiate a rotation on the takeoff, then smoothly pull it up like this. Now, do take out your joystick and see how does the control column respond when you are doing inputs. Because after all, the flight model is modeled for correct control column response, just like the real airplane would. And that probably applies to the vast majority of aircraft that we do have available in Flight Simulator. The next thing up here, check your stabilizer. I can't point this out often enough, but it is absolutely very much a problem that people do forget to trim the airplane. Another thing to cross-check is your flaps. Are the flaps in the correct takeoff setting? So if we look at the Boeing 737 range of aircraft, then we will notice the tailstrike angles are quite different depending on the different flap settings and the different aircraft types. So if we have a look, for example, at the 737-700, it has a tailstrike angle on takeoff of 14.7 degrees, while the 737-800 gives you only 11 degrees, and the 737-900 gives you 10 degrees of pitch where the tailstrike is going to occur on takeoff. If we also have a look into the different lift-off attitudes depending on the flap setting and their associated minimum tail clearances, we will see the following. For a 737-800 with a typical flap 5 takeoff, the liftoff is going to occur at 8 degrees, and we have a tail clearance of 51 centimeters. That means the tail of the airplane is going to get 51 centimeters above the runway before the actual liftoff occurs. Now, if we have a look into the different flap settings, if we take off with flap 1 instead of flap 5, that tail clearance is reduced to 33 centimeters only, and the liftoff will occur at 8.5 degrees. Now, if you rotate at a typical correct rate of approximately 2 to 2.5 degrees per second, that means on the normal rotation you're just about a second off the tail strike. Now, most flight simmers are rotating quite a bit faster than the recommended rotation rate, so here are a couple of normal rotation rates recommended. For the 737NG, use 2 to 2.5 degrees a second, with an engine failure 1.5 to 2 degrees. If you're flying an Airbus A320 or A310, the recommended rotation rate is approximately 3 degrees per second, so quite a bit faster than the 737. But tailstrike angles in the A310 are 11 degrees, while in the A320 a tiny bit more margin does exist. Here's another real quick look into the numbers before we move on to the tailstrike risk factors on landing. And that is, if you have a flap setting of 5 selected in the 737-900, then you only have 49 centimeters of tail clearance, while flaps 1 is also going to give you 33 centimeters, just like in the 800. But imagine what happens if you have takeoff speeds calculated for a flap 5 takeoff, and instead you are only selecting flaps 1. So let's have a look into the FMC to see how big that difference is. We have 148, 148, 153 up here for flaps 5. Now I'm entering flaps 1. And we can see that the actual takeoff speeds are 154, 155, 159. Now imagine you had only selected flaps 1 while you calculated for a flap 5 takeoff. You will have differences of approximately 7 knots. And now think about how quickly your airplane accelerates during the takeoff run. And if we throw all of that together, then we'll notice that if we are planned with a flap 5 takeoff, where liftoff should occur with 51 centimeters of tail clearance, but approximately just 1 second later, we are at the tailstrike attitude. Imagine what happens if you have to accelerate that additional 7 knots before you would actually be able to lift off, if you have selected flaps 1 rather than flaps 5. You will very, very quickly reach that tailstrike attitude. Now, Speaking about tailstrike and tailstrike attitudes, what do we actually do then when a tailstrike does happen on takeoff? Let's have a look into the associated QRH non-normal checklist, which we do have available just here from the QRH. So tailstrike on takeoff. Condition: the tail hits the runway on takeoff. There is a caution straight away: do not pressurize the airplane due to possible structural damage. So if that tailstrike has happened, then your cabin is likely to have received some sort of damage. So just prior to the tail skid up here, we have the aft bulkhead. Let's see if we can see that better from here. So somewhere over here you have that pressure bulkhead that basically forms the pressure cabin, and the aft part of that is unpressurized. Now if that bulkhead gets damaged, which can very well be the case if you think about your airplane actually being squeezed just about here, while the bulkhead is somewhere just about here. If you think about that happening, then this bulkhead might get damaged, and you might encounter a rapid decompression if that thing fails at one point. Or you might just about encounter a very slow decompression, or the airplane might not pressurize straight away. So, what are we going to do then? Well, the first thing to consider is, it has caution: do not pressurize the airplane due to possible structural damage. Now, if a tailstrike happens in a 737NG series, then chances are that it is going to be the cabin crew who is actually going to notice it. Most namely, the stewardesses sitting in the back galley, because they will be most likely to hear that scraping noise when the airplane hits the runway. It is going to take them a while, however. They are going to call the purser. The purser will think about things, and then the purser is going to eventually call the cockpit. Now, thinking about that, it normally takes about 4 to 5 minutes until the airplane passes flight level 100. That means that by the time the information about a tailstrike reaches the flight crew, chances are very good that we will actually have passed above flight level 100 already. And with the aircraft being above flight level 100, if we follow the consecutive steps of the tailstrike on takeoff checklist, namely pressurization mode select into manual, then outflow valve switch hold and open until the outflow valve position indicates fully open, and finally plan to land at the nearest suitable airport. But if we follow those two steps, what we are doing here is basically depressurizing the cabin. If we do that, we might deploy the passenger oxygen masks if the airplane is above flight level 140 already. So do hold the checklist here. If your cabin did not yet rupture by the time you have reached that altitude, it might be a good idea just to start descending the airplane again to at least flight level 100, so that you don't need the oxygen mask by the time you depressurize the airplane. Additional consideration afterwards: since the outflow valve will be fully open, that means your cabin altitude is going to vary just the same as your airplane altitude does. So a slow descent at maybe 500 to maximum 1,000 feet a minute might be necessary afterwards when flying your airplane back to the departure airport, or when landing at the nearest suitable airport. So that's something you take into account when you're executing this particular checklist. Now let's go ahead and talk about the, in real life, much more common tailstrike factors. Tailstrike on landing. While in flight simulation, it's actually 90% of the tailstrikes happening on takeoff and only 10% happening on landing. So, landing risk factors. A tailstrike on landing tends to cause more serious damage than the same event during takeoff, and is usually more expensive and time-consuming to repair. In the worst case, the tailstrike can strike the runway before the landing gear, thus absorbing large amounts of energy for which it is not designed. The aft pressure bulkhead is often damaged as a result. Any of the following landing risk factors may precede a tailstrike. Note that we are saying may over here because there can be other reasons as well. First of all, unstabilized approach. An unstabilized approach is the biggest single cause of tailstrike. Flight crews should stabilize all approach variables on centerline, on approach path, on speed, and in the final landing configuration by the time the airplane descends through 1000 feet above field elevation in IMC, or latest 500 feet above field elevation in VMC. And with any of these approach variables not stabilized, a go-around should be considered. That is what Boeing says, and actually in my company a go-around would become mandatory. Flight recorder data shows that flight crew continue with an unstabilized condition below 500 feet seldom stabilize the approach prior to landing. When the airplane arrives in the flare, it often has either excessive or insufficient airspeed. The result is a tendency towards lost thrust and pitch corrections in the flare, often culminating in a vigorous pitch change at touchdown, resulting in tail strike shortly thereafter. If the pitch is increased rapidly when touchdown occurs, as ground spoilers deploy, the spoilers add additional nose-up pitch force, reducing pitch authority, which increases the possibility of a tail strike. Conversely, if the airplane is slow, increasing the pitch attitude in the flare does not effectively reduce the sink rate, and in some cases may actually increase it if you are approaching a stall condition. A firm touchdown on the main gear is often preferable to a soft touchdown with the nose rising rapidly. In this case, the momentary addition of thrust may aid in preventing the tail strike. In addition, unstabilized approaches can result in landing long or even a runway overrun. Now, according to Boeing, this is the second most common cause of landing tail strikes. However, I tend to say that in flight simulation, this is probably the most significant factor in tail strikes on landing, and that is holding off the airplane in the flare in the attempt to make it a soft landing. And that often comes with a loss in airspeed that results in a rapid loss of altitude, so which basically becomes a dropped-in touchdown. This condition is often precipitated by a desire to achieve an extremely smooth soft landing, and a very smooth soft touchdown is not essential nor even desired, particularly if the runway is wet. So flight simmers tend to land aircraft or land airliners in a way that you would land a general aviation aircraft, which is basically holding the airplane off the runway until it actually stalls itself onto the ground. Now, you must not do this in an airliner. All airliners have to be flown onto the aiming point. So that means you consciously fly the airplane into the ground, and you do not just hold off the runway in an attempt to make the landing as smooth and soft as possible. I know that flight simmers tend to measure the greatness of a landing by the touchdown rate achieved, and in fact it's not only flight simmers doing that, but it is a lot of virtual airlines doing the same, and that is absolutely not recommended, and it will lead to tail strike eventually. Another factor contributing to tail strikes on landing is trimming in the landing flare. So trimming the stabilizer in the flare may contribute to a tail strike. The pilot flying may easily lose the feel of the elevator while the trim is running. Too much trim can raise the nose even when this reaction is not desired. The pitch up can cause a balloon, followed either by dropping in or pitching over and landing in a 3-point attitude. Flight crews should trim the airplane during the approach, but not in the flare. The next cause here is mishandling of crosswinds. When the airplane is placed in a side-slip attitude to compensate for the wind effects, this cross-control maneuver reduces lift, increases drag, and may increase the rate of descent. If the airplane then descends into a turbulent surface layer, particularly if the wind is shifting towards the tail, the stage is set for a tail strike. The combined effects of high closure rate, shifting winds with a potential for a quartering tailwind, the results in a sudden drop and wind velocity commonly found below 100 feet can result in a tail strike. Combining this with turbulence can make the timing of the flare very difficult, and the pilot flying can best handle the situation by using additional thrust if needed and by using an appropriate pitch change to keep the descent rate stable until initiation of the flare. Flight crews should clearly understand the criteria for initiating a go-around and plan to use this time-honored avoidance maneuver when needed. So, something to be very aware of that many flight simmers don't know is, if you are descending towards that landing runway and you're at a high pitch attitude already, then do not try to soften that landing by rotating the nose even higher. Instead, just add some engine thrust. That is possibly the single best course of action you can do there. Keep in mind, the nose is pointing above the horizon, so if you do increase thrust, there is quite a vertical downwards component in that engine thrust that effectively is nothing else than lift. So increasing that engine thrust will arrest your descent rate, while pitching the nose up higher will probably not. There is one more common reason for a tail strike on landing, and that is over-rotation during go-around. Go-arounds initiated very late in the approach, such as during landing flare or after touchdown, are common causes of tail strikes. When the go-around mode is initiated, the flight director immediately commands a go-around pitch attitude. If the pilot flying abruptly rotates up to the pitch command bar, a tail strike can occur before the airplane responds and begins climbing. During a go-around, an increase in thrust as well as a positive pitch attitude is needed. If the thrust increase is not adequate for the increased pitch attitude, the resulting speed decay will likely result in tail strike, as you are losing lift very rapidly below the VREF speed. Another contributing factor in tail strikes may be a strong desire by the flight crew to avoid landing gear contact after initiating a late go-around when the airplane is still over the runway. In general, this concern is not warranted because a brief landing gear touchdown during a late go-around is acceptable. This has been demonstrated during autoland and go-around certification programs in the 737. So this is the most common causes of tail strikes. Now, let's have a look into one practical example of a typical situation that almost resulted in tail strike. And we can find that one on the Aviation Herald. I will include the link in the video description below, but here it is on screen. And that is an incident where an Air France 777-200 at Paris on May 22, 2015 entered an incorrect takeoff weight. So they entered a takeoff weight 100 tons less than the actual takeoff weight of the aircraft. And I've chosen this particular example because in the end the pilots did a good job in avoiding that tail strike from happening by reacting. However, this example suits our intentions a lot better than actually just looking at an example where we say they over-rotated, they tail striked. So here's what happened on that day. An Air France Boeing 777-200 freighter, registration Fox Golf Uniform Oscar Charlie, performing freight flight Air France 6724 from Paris Charles de Gaulle to Mexico City, was accelerating for a balanced takeoff from Charles de Gaulle Airport runway 26 right when the crew detected the aircraft wasn't accelerating quickly enough and firewalled the engines. The aircraft took off without further incident. The crew discovered their takeoff weight had been programmed 100 tons below actual takeoff weight, resulting in incorrect takeoff power and reference speed computations, and completed a safe landing in Mexico City about 11 hours 15 minutes later. The airline reported, Air France confirms that a data insertion error on takeoff of cargo flight Air France 6724 operated by a Boeing 777 freighter from Paris Charles de Gaulle to Mexico on 22 May 2015 led to insufficient acceleration at the beginning of takeoff. The crew, who noticed this slow acceleration, immediately reacted by applying full thrust. The aircraft took off normally and the flight continued to its destination. The crew spontaneously declared this event by air safety report and informed their superiors. The French Bureau of Accidents in Aviation was informed. On June 2, 2015, the French BEA reported in their weekly bulletin that the crew used 243 tons of takeoff weight instead of 343 tons for computation of their takeoff performance. The resulting speeds were input into the flight management system, and during the rotation for takeoff, the crew noticed the aircraft did not become airborne, firewalled the engines, established maximum pitch possible without tail strike, lifted off, climbed out to safety, and continued to destination. The BEA resulted the occurrence a serious incident and opened an investigation. On December 21, 2018, the BEA released their final report in French language. And do note that editorial note there that those reports do need to be converted into English, because aviators all around the world speak only one common language, that is English. Therefore, an English translation should always be included. The French didn't do it in this case. Anyway, let's go on. The final report concludes the probable cause of the serious incident were: the overflight at low height of the runway end during takeoff was a result of a takeoff undertaken with erroneous parameters, as in low takeoff speeds, flap settings, and insufficient thrust. And as you will recall from our earlier look at possible tail strike reasons, you will notice that those reasons are very common factors for tail strike. Now, the crew did a good job in preventing that from happening. However, their actions of firewalling the thrust levers and therefore establishing maximum thrust did also expose the aircraft to additional tail strike risk. So that means that if they had an aircraft like, for example, the 737, where the line of thrust is below the center of gravity, that is the case in the 777 as well, by the way, then that additional thrust is going to cause an additional pitch up moment, and you as a pilot will have to be very careful in preventing the nose from lifting up further. The pilots did a very good job though at maintaining the pitch below the tail strike attitude and just waited for the airplane to actually lift off. Now, to continue on with the report, the false parameters entered in the FMS and used for takeoff were the result of a performance calculation based off a mass 100 tons less than the real mass of the aircraft. The error of 100 tons was the result of erroneous calculations by the flight crew, as well as entering the wrong mass into their performance tool in the electronic flight bag. Now, that is the point that we could just very quickly have a look at in our 737 cockpit to see how that could be prevented. And indeed, if you're following the SOPs that I have given in my tutorial videos on the 737, then you will notice that quite some of the stuff is actually covered in them. The most important thing there is, when you're entering that zero fuel weight, always cross-check the resulting gross weight against the takeoff performance calculator. So for example, in this case, if we accidentally entered 52.7, then the gross weight would be reduced by 10 tons as well. And then we could easily notice that, hold on a second, there is a much lesser gross weight in the FMS than there is in the takeoff performance calculator. And that would then lead us to trap the error of entering an incorrect zero fuel weight. Also, do note that it is very much desirable to cross-check that you actually have the correct speeds selected. So, if there is a very large difference between whatever takeoff calculation program you are using and the speeds calculated from the QRH in the FMC, then chances are there is something wrong. The V1 might easily be off, depending if the runway is wet, if the runway is dry, if you're using intersection figures whatsoever. But VR and V2 are normally within 1 knot of the FMC predicted values. And if they are grossly off, then that is very much of an indicator that you do have a performance problem in your calculations. Lastly, make sure that they are actually selected up here and that the no V-speed flag is not showing on the primary flight display, as that may very well give away that you do have some mathematic error done there. This shall conclude the video looking at causes for tail strikes and how to prevent them. I would like to thank you very much for your attention. This video did become a little bit longer than I initially suspected it would be. Nonetheless, I hope that you found this one really useful and that you've learned a lot out of it. Do let me know in the comments below if you think that there is any different reason for tail strikes. And finally, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for watching. Comment, like, subscribe if you haven't done so yet. And finally, if you really want to support the channel, you can do so through the Buy Me a Coffee link that you can find in the video description below. For now, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for watching. And I'm looking forward to see you all again, hopefully very soon.